want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. We're here to talk to you about the second and most recent version of the Facility Infection Risk Estimator. And we want this next hour or so to be as interactive as possible. So please submit lots of questions and comments, and let's try to make this more of a discussion rather than a presentation. So my name is Danny Diano, and I'll be presenting today along with Marcel Harmon. Marcel is a senior associate and runs our research and development team here at Branch Pattern. Over the last several years, he has dedicated his work to making buildings healthy and work for people. Some of that work resulted in the creation of the Health and Productivity Performance Estimator, or what we refer to as HAPI. Since the novel coronavirus outbreak, he's tailored that work into the Facility Infection Risk Estimator, which is what we will focus on today. I am the Net Zero Advocacy Manager at Branch Pattern and work with projects to identify and define their sustainability goals, ideally encouraging teams to choose aggressive net zero energy, water, or carbon goals for their building. Maybe in our future, we'll even see a net zero pathogen building. Branch Pattern is a building consultancy of engineers and scientists. Our name is inspired by the natural environment and how we use the natural environment to influence our design. Throughout our firm's history, our purpose has been improving life through better built environments. This is our mantra, and we use this message to influence everything we do. Our beliefs are rooted in nature, which has taught us that true sustainability sits at the intersection of human experience and environmental stewardship. And for our discussion today, our human experience within the built environment is whether or not you are going to get infected with a virus. These are the AIA learning objectives for today's presentation. Our main goal is that you leave this webinar feeling confident and ready to start modeling your own building to understand the transmission of SARS-CoV-2 indoors. Please ask questions or follow up with us afterwards if you'd like additional clarification on how to do this. All right, here's our agenda for today. So first, we'll discuss an overview of the updates and walk you through version 2. We'll then do a case study of a K-12 classroom and a dining area and a cafe using the tool and testing different strategies. If we have enough time, we will do a third or maybe fourth case study, and you'll be able to vote on what you want us to model. And we'll definitely be sure to leave enough time at the end for a live Q&A. So we are anticipating some of you have seen us present on version 1 of the tool. If you have not, Lauren will drop a link to a YouTube video, but in the sake of us having enough time to actually be in the tool, we're going to jump right into version 2 updates. If you have seen this presentation before, you know we also like to talk about how and why the tool was developed and the science behind it. Thankfully, there is a 70-minute video of Marcel and myself presenting on this, so if you want to refresh your memory or learn more about the background of the tool, please click that link and look that up and watch the first 20 or so minutes. But for now, we will just dive into version 2 here. So the biggest and most exciting change is that you can now model SARS-CoV-2 or the novel coronavirus or COVID-19, whatever you prefer to call it. And since it's no longer modeling just the flu, we did change the name to Facility Infection Risk Estimator, and it now includes 2 different viruses and gives us the potential to add more in the future. You'll also see some additional inputs to include more technologies and behavioral trends, such as upper room UVGI, portable filter units, and mask wearing. These all contribute to the removal or inactivation strategies to reduce transmission. Now we know from different occurrences across the country and the world that there are super spreading incidences that can vastly impact how aggressively the virus spreads. For instance, a nursing home in Washington State had a super shedder move furniture in various rooms before ever showing symptoms, which then infected and ultimately killed dozens of people. So we've learned that it matters whether you're a light, medium, or heavy shedder of the virus, and the activity you're doing can greatly impact how many droplets and of what size you expel. So we've added varying activity levels to the tool, resting, light, moderate, and heavy for both children and adults, as well as 3 different levels of virus shedding, low, medium, and high. And we've added different expiratory means, breathing, speaking loudly or singing, coughing, and sneezing. These additions paint a more holistic picture of what we are actually seeing in the real world. You can also alter the number of sick days now, indicating how many work or school days people will miss when they get this virus. The default for influenza is 5 sick days lost per infection, and for SARS-CoV-2, it's 17. And this is based on a weighted average from 3 different studies. Inputs for air change rates for both outdoor and recirculated air have been changed to CFM per space rather than CFM per person. You can typically find these numbers on mechanical drawings, as-built, or construction documents to get a good sense of what the space was designed for. But we also recommend taking real measurements so that you can model what's actually happening in the space. And to do this, you may need an engineer's help. I think we know where to find some if you want a recommendation. There's a hypothetical R value that now estimates the single space examined relative to the amount of exposure time selected. Epidemiologists use this number to mathematically describe the spread of a disease. It's a ratio where the numerator is the total number of people who got infected, and the denominator is the number of people who were infected to begin with. So ideally, this is less than 1, meaning the virus is dying out. But if this number is more than 1, it means the virus is growing. More people are being infected than who started off being infected. In the space we're modeling, we want this to be less than 1 to know that less people are infected based on the indoor environmental conditions we are modeling. And finally, some figures and tables have been reconfigured for clarity. So we're going to jump into the tool and show you how to get to the tool and some basic walk through the inputs. Okay, so we are just at branchpattern.com. This is our homepage. If you click this menu circle in the top corner and under research, find the Facility Infection Risk Estimator version 2.0. Click that link and you will be brought to the tool itself. So pretty easy to get there. Before we walk through the inputs, I want to point out this user guide here. So if you open this up, you'll see an interactive table of contents that you can select to learn more about these various items. We have our disclaimer, some pretty robust descriptions of the inputs and calculations, as well as all the outputs. So if you get stuck or confused on what you should be putting in or how you can find that information, this guide is constantly being updated to help you navigate through the tool. There's also references with links to our sources and the weighted average salary sources for the US. So when we're measuring productivity loss, we typically need a salary amount to put to that. And you can find those weighted average salaries if you don't know off the top of your head. And if you won't be too distracted by having a browser up, feel free to open this up and we can all follow along together. So if you scroll down, you'll see the tool here. There are 3 places to input information to then scroll down and find your results. So we'll walk through those quickly. You do need some room information and demographics. So we want to know the number of people under 18 and the number of people older, 18 or older, because adults and children spread the virus differently. And then we also want to know the activity level for both children and adults. So you'll see we have resting, light, moderate, and heavy. And if you're getting a little confused or forget what I'm saying, you can always hover your mouse over these information bubbles to get more information on how to select the right thing. So for activity level, for example, we have resting being sitting, reading, sleeping, or watching TV. Light would be standing or most domestic or office work or probably classroom work. Moderate would be climbing the stairs or light exercise, and heavy would be vigorous exercise. So in a K through 12 setting, for example, maybe you're using light for a classroom and then heavy for a gymnasium. Here's where you input the weighted average salary, room height and area, which gives us volume. If you do have UVGI, we need to know the mounting height, and then the number of rooms in the building, if most rooms are similar. Again, like a classroom, maybe you have 15 classrooms in a building. Finally, we have viral parameters is next. We select the virus type, which now you can toggle between influenza and SARS-CoV-2. We have removal time, which is the amount of time after the expulsion incident and how we're measuring removal efficiencies. So with it being set at 0.250, we're measuring 15 minutes after the incident of expulsion. This is exposure time per day. This has a big impact, how long you're in the room. So maybe for an office, it's 8 hours, maybe for a classroom, it's 6, maybe for a gym, it's 1. So definitely we want you to play around with this exposure time to see how that impacts transmission rates. We have exposure time per viral season. This number we recommend being closer to 1%. This is really what percentage of the entire viral season are you actually exposed in this space? So accounting for every hour and every day and every week and every month. So 1% is probably a better number, but you can go up as high as 5%, probably not higher than that. Sick days lost per infection, you can change this number, but the average for SARS-CoV-2 is 17, and for influenza it's 5. Number of infected people. So, typically we're modeling 1 infected person is coming into the space, but we have modeled a few scenarios where it's more realistic that maybe 2 people would come into the space infected. For example, a church where maybe a husband and wife are coming in together and they're both infected and don't know it yet. Maybe for a larger space like an airport terminal, you're modeling 3 people or 5 people that are coming in infected. So you can definitely change this. For most of the case studies we'll look at today, it'll be 1. Expiratory means, so we have breathing, speaking loudly, singing, coughing, and sneezing. Level of virus shedding, low, medium, and high. For most of the case studies, we'll look at medium. But if you want to see what would happen if a super shedder came into your space, you can model high and see how that changes things. And then we have vaccination rates. This is obviously 0 for SARS-CoV-2. For influenza, there are averages here through this information bubble to remind yourself, and these are based off of the last 9 years of CDC data for vaccination rates. So we have 57% for children and 42% for adults. Okay, and then lastly, we have our baseline and design conditions for the actual space that you're modeling. And this is similar to an energy model where you're going to be looking at a baseline compared to design. So when you're looking at your actual building, your baseline could be what the actual building is right now. And now you're playing with design conditions to see how to reduce transmission. The baseline could be a building built to code. And now you're showing how implementing certain strategies, you're reducing transmission rates more from code. Or maybe you already made some changes to your building and you want to show the community the impact those changes have had on transmission rates. So your baseline could be what your building was like operating back in February, and now your design is what it's operating like now to show people actual numbers around the decisions you've made for different strategies. So you need some information here. The baseline relative humidity, probably in the lowest winter extreme would be the best for modeling. So kind of the lowest relative humidity that you would see in your building. Baseline outdoor air and baseline recirculated air. And again, this is measured by CFM per space, which we will actually discuss more in detail how to find that information. But again, modeling what is actually happening is better than what it was designed to do. Then we have filter type here, MERV4 all the way to a HEPA filter, so you can experiment with different filtration levels. The UVGI information for irradiance we need, and then we've added portable air cleaning units. So you just put in the number of portable air cleaning units. And then we do need to know the clean air delivery rate, which is measured in CFM. That is available through manufacturer data. If your portable air cleaning unit does not have this number, it's probably not working very well because it's not showing you how much clean air it's delivering. So definitely be sure to ask for this number from the manufacturer. And then we've added mask wearing. So you can model no mask and then various types of masks. So cotton quilt, this would be one that maybe your neighbor sewed for you. If you've bought one online recently, it's probably more like one of these two. Or we have surgical and N95 masks. So depending on the scenario you're modeling, you know your occupants best. What are they wearing? What are you seeing them wear? And then you put in those exact same conditions for the design of the building. And then as you scroll down and, as you're entering numbers, and we'll see this in the case study, these graphs start populating with your results. And the last thing I want to show you before I hand it back to Marcel is saving results as PDF. once you've put in some things and you're ready to save and you want to show people, you can just click this button and save as a PDF here and save each variation that you're doing. So you don't have to remember the results off the top of your head anymore. All right. Marcel's going to talk about finding those CFM values, and then we'll launch into our first case study.
Okay, thanks, Danny, for kicking us off here. So before we jump into a case study, one of the questions that we get asked a lot is, how do I figure out what to put in for the ventilation and recirculation error numbers? So we can help you figure out what the design conditions should have been, but as Danny said, really there should be some spot check measuring to kind of verify what you're actually getting, because most likely it won't be what the design conditions are and there's a huge number of reasons why that's the case. But to give you a place to start, if you want to start with just figuring out the ventilation air, the outside air, there you can access ASHRAE 62.1. There are read-only versions that you can access through the ASHRAE website. The link is given here. And then you kind of scroll down till you find the maximum ventilation rates and breathing zone tables. And one of those tables, or part of that table, is shown here on the right. So to calculate it, that second set of bullets kind of discusses how to do that, but I'm just going to use a specific example to demonstrate how it's done. So let's say I've got an art classroom that I want to figure out what my ventilation rate at least should have been from a design standpoint. So if you look over here in the art classroom, the first thing we need to do is figure out what the design occupants should have been to calculate the ventilation rates. And so there are default values given in this column here, density values. So it's for the art classroom is 20 per 1,000 square foot. And so you just multiply that times the square footage in your space. So in this case, it's 1,500. And so the total occupants is 30. That's what I use to calculate the required ventilation. So then that ventilation number to calculate it is based on understanding or estimating what's required from the number of occupants I have in the space, the design that I just calculated, as well as the square footage. So there's two components to figure out. So the first one is you take the CFM value per person, which is 10 in this case, and multiply that times the number, which was 30, which you just calculated, so that's 300. Then you need to add the additional amount per square footage. So I've got 0.18 square foot per CFM. So I multiply that times the 1,500 as well, and I add that together. And so the total ventilation from a design standpoint, at least to start with, is 570 CFM of outside air. Most likely, systems aren't delivering that, or at least parts of the year they may not be delivering that for a variety of reasons. But that's a place to start. So then how do I figure out what my recirculation air is? So in that case, recirculation air is just your total supply air, subtract the ventilation air from that. And so then you need to kind of figure out, so what's my total supply air? So as Danny mentioned, you can reference as-built mechanical drawings if you have them. Typically on the drawings, you'll look on the plans, a lot of times next to the diffusers for each space that lists the CFM that comes out of each diffuser, that's total. And you add that up per room, and that's your total CFM per space. If you don't have access to that or don't really understand what you're looking at on the drawings, there's a very rough, and this is very rough, the rough rule of thumb that outside air is 20% of your total supply air. So you could divide your outside air by 0.2, and that gives you your total supply air, or at least a rough approximation. So then in that case, for the art classroom, then if, let's say I didn't have drawings and I'm just using that rough rule of thumb, my total supply air would then be 2850, 570 divided by 0.2, and then the recirculation air is the 570 subtracted from that 2850, or 2280. So that's a place to start. But like I said, there's lots of reasons that may not be the case. Then you really should probably involve an engineer or a commissioning agent to kind of help you look at your system, verify, do you have outside air dampers that are closed shut that you don't realize? Are you is it winter conditions and the system, the way it's set up, ramps down outside air much more than what that ASHRAE recommendation is? There's lots of reasons it's going to vary, and so it's not a bad idea to at least do some spot checks. And there's a really good guide for if you're a facility manager to help you figure out how to do that on your own. It was produced by the Harvard University here, and there's a link to it. And it walks you through, it says for classrooms, but you could use it for multiple building types. And it walks you through detailed steps on how, and it's not that hard, how to do it. Some cases there's some equipment required, but if you don't have that equipment, there's alternative ways to measure it without it. So it's a really good way that you could do some spot checks in your buildings to verify what you're actually getting. And then for selecting the portable HEPA filter units, our tool will help give you at least a rough indication in terms of what those impacts will be from a risk standpoint. But there's a more detailed tool to help you walk through selecting them here that Harvard and CU Boulder put together. It's also really good. I highly recommend referencing it. Now, unfortunately for upper room UVGI systems, if that's something you're really interested in looking at, you're going to need to talk to a consulting engineer and manufacturer and contractor to help you get that done. It's not something you can do on your own. Okay, so let's dive into the first case study. So we've got a K through 12 classroom. Again, we're going to look at SARS-CoV-2. It's 1,000 square foot, 9-foot ceilings. Let's say we've got 15 of them in the building that are very similar to that. And let's look at two conditions. The first, one of the conditions will be it's a fully occupied space, 25 students. But then we'll also look at, let's say we're de-densifying and we're going to have that to 12 students. So we'll look at both of those situations. And we'll say there's 2 adults in the space, a teacher and a parent. And let's say their exposure is 6 hours for that day. And we'll assume we've got an arid climate and it's a winter condition. So the relative humidity, worst case, around 20%. Light activity, we're in the classroom. Let's start with one infected person. We're going to also look at breathing and speaking. Those are your typical exploratory means that you're going to find in a classroom with asymptomatic people, right? So we're assuming that, right now in the heat of COVID, most people, the recommendations is if you're sick, don't go in, right? Stay home. But you still could have asymptomatic people in there, and so the most likely means of expiration is going to be breathing and speaking. We'll start with just a medium shedder. Looking at the viral season over time, and we're not going to really focus on that a whole much. It's less important for COVID. When you're looking at flu, you can look at kind of yearly impacts on productivity and health. But right now with COVID, it's a new situation. We're dealing with it different. We've got it in there. You can do it, but it's probably best just to focus on your immediate exposure on a daily basis. But if you are going to do it, I'd set it pretty low, since we're looking at it. The viral season for COVID is all year, so it's through the whole school year. And then we'll start with the code or ASHRAE requirements for this space would have been 455. But in the case when you're talking, let's say we have a VAV system here, so the baseline, it's a winter conditions maybe, and the box is really clamped down, and so we're only getting a percentage of that outside air, and so something that's not it's not unreasonable to find would be something as low as 135 CFM per space. During the winter, so we'll look at that, and 255 CFM per space of recirculation air, and a MERV 7 filter. We'll start out as our baseline condition. So then going to our design, looking at what we're going to compare to. We'll bump up that outside air to not just the minimum ASHRAE recommendation, but we'll go 30% above it. And so this will be 621 CFM per space. We'll keep the recirculation air the same and bump up the filter to MERV 13. Then we'll also look on top of that, adding masks. And I'll use the hybrid layer here. So everybody's wearing masks. In schools, if they're getting PP supplied, you might actually also have surgical masks, which is a little bit better, but I'm just going to stick with the cloth mask for now. We'll also look at what happens if we bump up the relative humidity to 40%. And then I'm also going to look at adding portable air cleaners. And then I'll look at what is it if I add upper room UVGI. We'll look at all these situations to see what the impacts are for this first case study. Okay, so here's the output. Let me explain what this whole table shows. So The baseline is these first two columns here. So it's the breathing and the speaking conditions. So that brackets basically the potential risk that you're going to find under those conditions. 21.8% to 60.4% is the probability of infection, right? With that very low outside air, MER7 filter, and nobody wearing masks, right? And no other strategies in point. So it's pretty high probability of infection. The next one is the design where we're just increasing the outside air and the filter level. And then the next set here, we add masks on top of that. So mask wearing on top of that. And then on top of that, we look at what happens if I bump up the relative humidity for those next pair. Now the last couple of pairs here, I'm not adding the portable air cleaners on top of the relative humidity. In that case, I'm backing relative humidity back down, and now I'm just adding portable air cleaners. And then I'm taking the portable, for the last one, we take the portable air cleaners out, and we're just doing upper room UVGI. So that's what these represent. And then the R value, and like I said, this is just like a hypothetical. What would it be if all your population was just that room itself? And so it's just another indication of what the quality of the results are. That's it. And ideally, you want it below 1. That means nobody else is getting infected when we have one person infected. And then the additional potential people that are infected after those 6 hours, that's just this probability of infection multiplied by the number, in this case, the number of students at 25. So that's what this is. So, and then if it's red, that means that this value down here is greater than 1. If it's black, it's less than 1. So obviously, as we go from left to right, everything decreases, which is what we want to see. When we start getting all the way down these last two options, when we're breathing, looks like nobody may be potentially infected. The actual is going to be in between here. It's somewhere. So I mean, and even when we're adding math, it's not. It's still, there's still a potential somebody's going to get infected, but it's much lower than from our starting point. So, these strategies definitely have an impact. Now, what happens if we add the dedensifying on top of that? So now it's at 12 students instead of 25 students. So the probability of infection stays the same based on the parameters that are used in this model. But because you have less people, you're going to have less people likely infected as a result of that, right? Because that percentage, you take that percentage times the number of people. So now we're just multiplying by 12 instead of 25. So we have a lot less number of people potentially that can become infected as a result of that. And so that's why dedensifying is a major strategy. The other thing that does, and after Danny goes through this case study on the tool, I'm going to pull in the other thing on top of that is that it also impacts the potential that you have somebody in there that's infected, which is something important to consider as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Danny here to walk you through this on the tool.
Thanks, and if anyone has any questions, just feel free to get those entered. I did answer one question via typing that I can talk about as we scroll through here. So we'll start by entering the demographics and room information. So we're going to do 25 students. At least in Colorado, that seems to be more applicable to what's actually happening. Light activity, we'll do 2 adults with light activity. And then the weighted average salary, you don't need to input anything here if you don't want to. Or if it's just another measurement to show productivity lost with sick days for the adults. So like if you put 55,000 as like an average salary of the adults in this space, we'll see those results coming down. Okay, our room height is 9-foot ceilings and our area is 1,000 square foot classrooms, no UVGI, and we'll have 15 classrooms in the building. Okay, so for viral parameters, we're going to model SARS-CoV-2. We'll look at 15 minutes after the incident of expulsion. I think we're doing a 6-hour school day. 1% exposure time over the viral season. 17 sick days lost for infection. We'll leave that as the default. One infected person. We're going to look at breathing. I know Marcel was looking at breathing and speaking, but just for the sake of keeping it consistent. And then we'll have a medium shudder. So for our building conditions, we will do 20% relative humidity. Our baseline outdoor air is going to be 135 CFM. Recirculated will be 255. MERV 7 filter. No UVGI, no portable air cleaning units, and no masks. Design will leave at 20%, but we will bump up outdoor air to 621 and recirculated air to 255, right? So with a MERV 13 filter. For now, let's just see what that does to our results. So you scroll down here. The first set of graphs is the risk impact summary for adults and for kids. And this is where you'll see the dollar amount here. So if I put $0 in for weighted salary, these numbers here would just be 0. But what it's showing you is that your design number of adults infected per viral season goes from 9 to 3 by making these changes in the space, which is 6 less adults infected per viral season. And if you multiply that by 17 days lost per each individual, that's getting you this decrease in salary dollars lost per viral season. There's obviously more kids, and that's what we tend to care about. So we'll focus on these graphs here. So just like Marcel's table showed, this is showing you that per day, per room, the baseline conditions, 5.5 children would be infected per day, per room with our baseline conditions. And once we increase outdoor air and increase our filtration, that's going to 1.8. So 3.7 less children are infected per room per day. And then we have child days lost here too, which I know a lot of districts kind of care about those numbers, so that's available. Then we have probability of infection. So these gray numbers here is what Marcel's table was showing. So we have the design versus the baseline, and then the decrease per day and per viral season. So our baseline 21.8% probability of infection, and with those couple changes to the design classroom, it's dropped to 7, which is a 14.8% decrease. Our next table here is removal efficiencies, and this is, you know, I focus on the totals here, which is showing you that the removal efficiency of the virus 15 minutes after the incident of expulsion is 75.5% with our design and only 34% with the baseline. And you'll see that, you know, obviously the relative humidity inactivation is nothing because we didn't change that between the design and the baseline. We only changed ventilation and filtration. And then finally, this is the R value that we're talking about here. So this is showing you that our baseline is 5.8 and design is 1.9. That still means, because that's greater than 1, that means more people are leaving the space, if that's our total population, sick than who entered the space. And just to show you, I know Marcel looked at masks, portable air cleaning units, and relative humidity. We're just going to look at masks first. So the hybrid cotton, 1 layer. Marcel, did you model 100% of people wearing masks? I think you're saying it.
Yeah, I did, 100%.
Okay, and then this 100% does take into consideration that there will be kind of some misfitting of masks, so that rule of thumb of how many people are actually wearing it, 100% is still going to take into account some people aren't wearing them correctly. Okay, so now again, as we scroll down to the kids, we see that number of infected per day drop even more. So now only 1.2 kids are infected per room per day. Here we have the design infection per day percentage dropping to 4.8%. So that's a 17% decrease per day compared to, like, I think it was 14 in our last example. And our design removal efficiency went all the way up to 81.9%, and our R value decreased to 1.3. Let's look at relative humidity. So if we increase our design relative humidity to 40%, then again, we'll see those similar differences that Marcel's table showed. So decreases in child infection per day. That didn't drop, I don't think.
There isn't, yeah. After doing all the other stuff, the impact of relative humidity is relatively small. If you did it first, it would be larger, but overall, it's still less than the other strategies typically. Depends on the room size to a degree, but most of the time, it has less of an impact.
But now you can see this relative humidity inactivation efficiency is 3.8% by doubling it. So that concludes the case study for K through 12. We're going to do a second case study here for a dining area of a cafe. I know as it gets colder, people are looking for places to dine inside for meetings or to meet up with friends. So let's see if that's a good idea in terms of viral transmission.
So before I jump to the cafe, though, real quick, I want to talk a little bit about total risk, basically, relative to what the transmission rates might be within your community. So, I mean, calculating that probability of infection is important to have an understanding of what the potential impacts are, but that's assuming, right, that somebody is infected in the space, or two people are infected in the space, whatever you said. But it may not, I mean, there's still, you know, most of the time that's still not going to happen. So what's the probability of that occurring? So the best way to at least get kind of a rough idea of what that might be is to look at your county COVID data. And most counties are providing that in some type of dashboard. So I've got Johnson County, Kansas pulled up here as an example. And I think I looked at this, I think the last time I looked at it was Sunday or Monday. But so it provides, there's two numbers at least that I've been looking at to kind of bracket what that potential range might be. The first is the cases per 100,000, and most of them are doing some type of rolling average over the last several days, so it's not fluctuating, you know, a lot from day to day. So they're averaging it over. I've seen 14 days is used a lot. I've also seen 5 days, but this is giving you the number of infected per 100,000, which you can then equate to a percentage. And in this case, it was 0.25% of the population. And that is likely an underestimate of the actual number of cases. It doesn't account for, you know, the asymptomatic people or people that are symptomatic that decide not to go get tested. But so it underestimates the range. Now, there's another number, percent positivity rate, and that is the percentage of the tests that come back positive. And so in Johnson County, they do two types of calculations. So it's a range of 7.4 to 13.7%. And that's an overestimation most likely, because it's not, the denominator is just the number of people that decide to go in to get tested, right? So it's not a statistically representative sample of the population either. So, and it's like, in most cases, it's probably an overestimate by a fair amount of percentage points. So likely that while that's your bracketing range, potentially, likely that number, that percentage of infection within your community is closer to the lower end somewhere. And in this case, for the purposes of this example, I assumed 1.25%. Yeah, that could still be overestimating it, but it's hard to know. And I'm certainly not an epidemiologist. It's just, this gives you at least something else to look at your data with. So if you have 25 students and that's your infection rate, the probability that one of them out of 25 is infected is roughly 27%, using basic probability math. If it's only 12 students, then it's only 14% the probability, which is, like I said, that's one reason why dedensifying has an impact. So let's look at incorporating that into the analysis that we just did. So the grayed out rows are what we talked about, probability of infection, and then the additional number of infected. And now let's see what is the, if that is actually the infection rate in the community, 1.25%, what's the risk then given those probability of infections on any given day walking into that room? And so you just multiply the two together, and so that's what this risk, the percentage is down here. So obviously it's lower than the probability of infection because the probability that somebody out of those 25 is infected is less than 100%. And so it does bring it down, right? It's still, if you're the speaking conditions, it's still potentially problematic for most of them, but your actual risk, if that's what your actual infection rate is, comes down. And then it comes down even more, obviously, if you're looking at just 12 students, right? So now almost hardly any of them is the potential that you might walk out and infected after 6 hours. So it's another, we don't have that in the tool because our focus is the building itself. And what number you would use here it's hard to say. At least it's hard for us to say. If you want to talk to your county people to get a better idea of what that better number is to use, you could do that and then do a similar type of analysis and have a better idea. But I'm certainly not qualified to tell you that. I just know that it's somewhere in there, and that's another way to look at the risk that your schools or other populations might be having when walking into any given space.
And one way I like thinking about it that Marcel talked to me, is like this tool, you only get results if you're assuming one person is infected. If 0 people are infected, the results will be nothing. And so figuring out whether one person will even be infected coming into your space, you definitely have to look at your community rates of infection. Otherwise, all the results are 0, which is kind of what we want, right? So, when we look at this next case study, the cafe dining, assuming 2 people come into a restaurant sick may not be that unrealistic depending on where you are.
Right. So yeah, so for the second case study here, let's say it's a 1,300 square foot, it's a small cafe, 10-foot ceiling. Design conditions for calculating the ventilation was 90, but you most likely won't have that many in there, even if it wasn't dedensified. So we'll start with just 40 patrons. Assume a 60-minute time in the space. You're just sitting there eating and talking, light activity. We'll look at both 1 and 2 infected people, breathing and speaking, and just a medium shudder. And we'll assume the same winter conditions, arid climate, 20% relative humidity. So baseline, again, we're going to start out assuming that we are underventilated, which is from a state, that's a good place to start if you haven't verified what the numbers actually are. So starting with 140 CFM per space, recirculated air 600 CFM per space, MERV 7 filter. And so in this case, let's just say that they don't have the capabilities to make any changes to their system. And so we're going to set that the same. What other strategies could they employ to help, improve conditions? So we'll look at mask wearing, but we're in a restaurant, so likely, even if everybody was really compliant and only took their mask down to take a bite and put it back up, you still would have a percentage of time where people don't have masks on. So actually, I'm just going to start with 50%. Wearing masks, and then also assuming that the infected person is not wearing a mask. And then we'll look at adding portable air cleaners, 2 of them for this size of space, and see what we get. So first set of 3 pairs of conditions here are for 1 infected, and this is with 2 infected people. Probability infection, so this is obviously lower than the last example, and that's primarily driven by time of exposure, right? So the last one was 6 hours of exposure. Here we're just talking about 1 hour of exposure. So obviously these values are lower. With 40 people, you're still going to have conditions where potentially people are going to get infected after being exposed for that long. But certainly, if you do the portable air cleaners, that helps quite a bit. Even if you have 2 infected people, it helps quite a bit. And then we'll talk a little, after Danny goes through this online, we'll talk a little bit more what this means relative to the potential community infection rates.
All right, so we'll walk through this case study together. So we'll assume no children are at this restaurant. So 0 people under 18, and we're going to say that there are 40 adults dining. Light activity, we'll remove weighted salary for now, just because these people are just patrons to the restaurant. We have 10-foot ceilings and a 1,300 square foot room. No UVGI, and we'll have 1 room in this space. Measuring SARS-CoV-2, 1 hour of dining. Oh my gosh, why can't I get this today? Okay, 1% exposure time for viral season, 17 sick days lost. We're going to say 2 infected people. We're going to assume everyone in the restaurant is speaking to each other, and a medium virus shedder. 20% relative humidity, 140 CFM of outdoor air, 600 CFM of recirculated air, MERV7, with no masks is our baseline. Design, we're going to say the same humidity and the same amount of air, so 140 and 600. And we're going to keep it at MERV7. But we will add wearing masks. And you said 50% for both groups of people, Marcel?
Yeah, 50% for non-infected, and none of the infected people are wearing a mask.
Okay. So we'll scroll down here to see, obviously the child risk is going to be 0 because we said there are no children here. So for adults infected per day, our baseline is 4.3. Our design is 3.6, so it went down 0.6 people. And so this is assuming 50% of non-infected people wearing masks, and that's it. That's the only changes we've made. Scroll down to probability of infection. Our design is 9.1. The baseline is 10.7, so it decreased 1.6%. And our removal efficiency didn't decrease very much, less than a percentage. And then we have our hypothetical R value is 1.8. But if we add those 2 portable air cleaning units, so we have 2 of them with 300 CFM, we'll see this decrease significantly. So now there's 2.8 less people per day. And again, this is 1 hour. So per that hour, 2.8 less people are infected in our cafe. And the probability of infection per day went down 6.9%. Our removal efficiency is getting much better, 69%. And our hypothetical R value is less than 1.
Hey, Danny, can you go ahead and do one? Somebody asked if we could just change the MERV13 under design conditions too and see what happens.
Sure. Now 3 people, less people per day, per room. And our probability of infection went down to 3.1%. Our design total efficiency is now 77%, and the hypothetical R value went down to 0.6.
So one thing to remember as you use the tool, and so as you add successive strategies, so each time you do something, the percentage goes down, and so then the change that then happens after that for each successive change, that delta will decrease just because the percentage that you're starting from already. So if you want to see kind of how different, what strategies, what the real impacts are, or what the more apples to apples comparison, you could do one and then set it back to what it was before and make your other change, and compare that, and set that back to what it was before and make your other. And that's a better way to like actually compare individual strategies in terms of their effectiveness, or at least how much they're actually contributing.
Marcel, what do you want to do? Do you want to do a third case study, or should we go into Q&A?
Real quick, let me, what time is it?
We have about 20-ish more minutes.
Let me just really quickly talk about the community part for the cafe, and then we can do Q&A.
Okay. So please get your questions in. We'll run through these here in a few minutes.
So if we're looking at this now in terms of what the potential range of the community spread rate is, so we'll stick with that 1.25% again. And if there's 40 patrons, the probability that 1 out of 40 is infected with that community rate would be about 40%. For 2 to be infected, that would be only about 15%. And so then you can use those probabilities down here to figure out what the total risk under each of these scenarios is. And so that pulls it does pull it way down, so that after that hour, the risk is relatively small that anybody else is going to get infected. Now, there's something that I want to point out here that's really important to consider for all of these analyses. This is a simplified model that assumes immediate distribution of the virus immediately within the room. And so what it does is it calculates an average, and so the actual probabilities of infection will vary over time as the virus is removed, as well as it moves throughout the room, as it expands. And so there will be times when those nearest the person are actually at a greater risk than what's shown here. And those obviously at the far end, maybe they're at 0 for a certain amount of time. So that's important to consider. So while the average here shows, considering that a lower community spread rate, maybe it's not so bad. If you happen to get somebody in there and maybe they're a high shedder, that risk still could be more. And something to consider is, do you want to spend your risk capital on in-person dining, or should we be spending it on in-person school? So those are all things that we need to be considering in our own communities as we're looking through these types of analyses. So I think with that, let's go ahead and go to Q&A.
So the first question here is, are you going to account in future estimators for the lost days of parents who will have to stay home when the child is sick? And I think this brings up a good point for us to discuss, is that this tool is meant to look at the indoor built environment, which is what we are experts in, not these like community kind of ripple effects. So when we're looking at child sick day loss or productivity loss, we're looking at the people in that space for the time that you enter into the tool. There are a lot of other productivity losses when people are out sick that we don't consider in the tool, like maybe training somebody else to do someone else's job for 2 weeks while they're out. But we're really just looking at the most conservative number in our parameters of the tool itself. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Marcel?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. We're primarily focused on the building itself. Now, communities, when they're analyzing all this, they should be taking that type of data into account for sure. Certainly agree with that. You have to look at what the impacts, and I've seen studies where they are doing that now. They are taking the larger community productivity impacts, parents not being able to work, the future lost earning impacts of kids in terms of their impacts not being in school. Now they're looking at that as well. All those, that needs to be part of the conversation here. As consultants, AEC industry consultants, we're limited in terms of the data that we have available to do these types of analysis. Certainly on a case-by-case basis, we could help do some of that. But in terms of just putting a tool together to be able to do this, that's a little bit beyond our typical scope. And so we are more focused on just the building itself and what those more direct impacts that we have access to, the data that we have access to.
We have a question about research being done regarding the MERV ratings. Is there a link or a reference that we can guide people to show the benefits of MERV 13 versus MERV 7 or 8?
There's been a couple studies that have looked at this. And the link is actually in the references in the user guide. There's a 2013, I think it's 2013 study by the main author. I'm drawing a blank on his name, but he does look at, and actually it's the study that kind of kicked off us thinking about how to build this tool. But he looks at filtration, removal level filters, and the impacts on removal efficiencies for various particle contents. We send out a link. What are we going to send out afterwards, Danny? Because it's going to include some of this information.
Yeah, we'll send out the survey with the slides. So, and
can we include some supplemental information with that?
Yeah, I've also asked Lauren to track down that link and drop it in the chat. So hopefully you can find that from the reference from the user guide.
Yeah, and then if you're on Twitter and you're following some of the, I should have put a slide together for all the researchers you should be following on Twitter, but there's been a ton of links to that study as well as a bunch of other ones that are looking at filter impacts as well. Richard Corsica, Dr. Miller out of University College, Shelley Miller out of University of Colorado Boulder. Drawing a blank on all of them. There's a whole bunch, but we can put those, we can share that as well.
Have we considered adding additional MERV ratings to filter options? I found that MERV 6 and 8 are rather common, especially in schools. And I'm smiling because I actually was looking at this last week and trying to model MERV 8. So.
Yeah, so the filters that we have in there are based on the studies that we had available to plug in there. The differences won't be, I mean, like a MERV 7 versus MERV 8, it's not going to be a huge difference. If you've got a MERV 8, just throw the MERV 7 in there for your baseline. Yeah, so I mean, kind of select what's closest.
This tool is showing you like good, better, best examples of how to reduce transmission as much as possible. The intent is not for you to take this and say, one person will be infected in this space with fact and conviction. We're really just modeling, comparing a baseline to a design condition. So if your baseline is, you want it to be MERV 6 and MERV 8, you can do MERV 4 and MERV 7 to still show a difference, but not, don't quote that only 3 people will be infected in case 6 actually get infected. So it's meant to be a tool to help you make decisions when there's hundreds of different strategies to consider. What's the good, better, best opportunity for you and your building to make those decisions, to provide you some data, but it's not a set in stone number.
Right. I mean, if you're familiar with energy modeling, actual performance can vary substantially from the energy model. It's a tool to help evaluate strategies, and so this is a tool to help evaluate strategies. It doesn't mean that that's the actual what you're actually going to get out of it, because there's so many variables, right, that are impacting this. And all models are simplified versions of reality, just to kind of help you grasp the situation and justify decisions moving forward.
Is there any data showing if opening windows changes the infected rate?
Yeah, so yeah, opening the windows increases your ventilation rate, and there are ASHRAE there are means to calculate that as well. We haven't included that directly into the tool because it can vary. I mean, it's hard to. We're estimating a really simple box here, for the tool, and trying to then throw in natural ventilation relative to what your actual configuration might be. It could change it substantially. So there are, but yes, ventilation is one of the means, or natural ventilation is one of the means for increasing the outside air in your space. And it can have, depending on the size of your space, it can have as big an impact or more than what your ability to increase the mechanical ventilation. So it's just now that we're moving into winter, it's less people are going to keep their windows open less likely or less often.
Will you be offering general lessons learned from your iterations of the tool? This is a great plug for our webinar next Wednesday. And also, I think the standard ventilation rates overestimate reality in most circumstances, assuming no operable windows. Part of that question, I think. So I'll just first talk about, we do have another free webinar next Wednesday where we'll be looking at case studies where we've actually implemented and used the tool to help owners make decisions, and really using the data to communicate to occupants why they've made certain decisions is another big piece of this. So I'll make a plug for that. And then Marcel, I don't know if you want to hit on the ventilation rates.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. What you calculate in ASHRAE is over. I mean, the sad thing is that that's not even adequate in and of itself, right? That's a whole other discussion. We've done lots of other talks on that, but that in and of itself isn't enough, and most buildings don't even meet that. So yeah, which is why we said really you should be doing some spot checking and measurements to verify what you're actually getting.
And then I did see a question in the chat. This is kind of a loaded question. Do we have a basis for what an acceptable risk would be, or a basis for understanding or collectively accepting an acceptable risk?
Risk acceptance varies widely based on individual preference, and regional and community and cultural issues all play into what's acceptable or not. For me, a lot of our goals, like let's get that number down so that there's less than one person is affected when you multiply the probability of infection by the number of people in the space. But maybe that in some situations you're overdoing it. You may not need to do that much. In other cases, maybe it's underdoing it, depending on what your community spread rates are. So that is difficult. That's why a lot of this is a lot of our discussion and use of the tool with people up to this point has been talking about what the delta is. How much can you improve it doing from this to this? And then it's really up, a school district or a community or an office, an employer. They got to decide is that an acceptable amount of risk to have for my people, for my patrons, for my students, for my parents, and that's a discussion that has to happen locally. Particularly now, since we don't have a national coordinated strategy to help do this, it's really it falls on states and local communities to figure this out. So the thing to remember is that there are significant strategies to reduce risk, and we should be employing those strategies. And I think, school is in the news a lot in terms of whether we should be in person or not. There are significant strategies available to reduce that risk, both in the building and then maintaining a low community spread rate to make it happen. And if we were more effective at doing that, I think we'd have a lot more kids in school right now. That's my own personal opinion, based on looking at what the research says and doing our own analyses and talking to other researchers. But,
I do think even our company, which is relatively small, but we have offices in different cities, and seeing, you know, we looked at Johnson County rates. Marcel and I were also looking at Denver County rates, which is where I am, and how much lower the rates are in Denver, but how much more strict our community guidelines are. And so I think every city, every community is going to have different expectations for what the adequate amount of cases are in their community. And so, you know, I think it's been really eye-opening seeing the different reactions and the different changes in ordinances in different cities based on different case numbers. So are there any other questions? Getting a lot of compliments in the chat, which I appreciate. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Our contact information is up here. We'd be happy to walk through your specific building. We didn't get to other case studies like we wanted to, but if you want to set up a meeting with us, we'd be happy to get that scheduled. So feel free to email us, call us, and hopefully we'll see you next week for our next webinar.